Welcome. We are just waiting another minute or two to see if our last panelists will join us. In the meantime, welcome on behalf of the HIP Migration Program to HIP's People on the Move webinar series. We are offering interpretation, English to Spanish and Spanish English interpretation on this webinar. So if you need interpretation, click on the globe icon on your home screen to have access. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas. Si necesita interpretación, tenemos interpretación. Solo tienes que presionar el botón del globo para poder acceder a interpretación entre inglés y español. Vamos a esperar un minuto más para empezar. And maybe while we're waiting, so we're just trying to give it one more minute for folks who are already with us. I see a large handful. Feel free to add your name in the chat, your affiliation, and let us know why you're here in this conversation. This will help give our panelists information to use in their conversation. So feel free to add your name, your affiliation, and what brought you to this conversation. Jose, maybe give me a thumbs up when you think I should start.
Thanks, Amalia. I think just a minute.
Okay, great. As folks are joining, we're good? Okay, perfect. Hi, everyone. Welcome again to our migration program webinar series. Throughout 2022, we're calling Centering Frontline Voices Across the Americas. This is the fourth session called Lessons from BIPOC Communities on Healing, Justice, and Migration. We do have interpretation available for those who have just joined. So just click on the interpretation icon or the globe icon at the bottom to access English to Spanish interpretation. My name is Amalia Brindis Delgado, Vice President of Impact and Strategy with HIP, and I'm so excited for this conversation and to see all of you. Bienvenida, Odilia. So as we're getting started, feel free to drop your name, affiliation, why you're here in this webinar. Thanks so much, Javier, for dropping your name. In this session, we're going to be talking about the lessons that BIPOC communities have learned about healing justice as relevant for migrant communities and migrant serving organizations across the Americas. We will also provide a space for funders and non-funders to share and learn from each other on how best to support and build this intersectional work. We know that forced displacement causes trauma and that migrants in their communities suffer exclusion. We've seen over and over events that impact our communities and layer that trauma, and that the same systems that are creating oppression and discriminating against Black and Indigenous folks here in the US are also impacting immigrants and criminalizing us, detaining us, and furthering our trauma. Organizations we work with know that healing justice is important and that it needs further support in order to get it to more folks and the folks who are serving those who are most impacted. And that's why we've invited those who are here before us to talk about this, for us to have more conversation to how do we deepen these resources. And I'm so grateful to all of you for the work that you've been doing and for the way that those funders who are here have been resourcing this work and thinking about how do we deepen our healing justice for migrant communities and all of our communities, particularly as these events continue to happen. So I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Stephanie Roman, who goes by Roman. She is born and raised in Sonoran Desert of the O'odham land, an artist, Chicana, and cisgendered woman. She is involved and has been involved in the social justice sector since 2012 and is an incredible artist herself. At HIP, she is our senior program manager and leads our leadership and racial equity initiatives that includes narrative and healing efforts. So her vision of the Latinx community comes from 7 generations, and she is just phenomenal. I'm so lucky, Roman, that you're joining our conversation today and leading us through this discussion. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It is great to be here with you all. Special thank you to the migration team for inviting me into this space. As Amalia mentioned, I am the senior programs manager at HIP. I am also the daughter of two migrant parents who came to the US from Mexico. I live on Tohono O'odham land, which is now known as Arizona. And at HIP, I've also supported the organization's internal practices around healing, wellness, and as a transnational organization, one of the most important lessons that we learned was the importance of language justice and making information, however basic it may feel, available to people's preferred languages. And that's just one example of the way that we can promote safety, wellness, and justice for individuals. And I'm so excited to be moderating the space with the organizations today who are working with migrant communities, who have been generous enough to share with us their wisdom and their lessons learned around healing justice and transformative justice. As we all know, migration and forced displacement can cause severe trauma from the events that caused the displacement and even the events during the journey and once you reach your destination. And so often migrants are excluded from existing services or otherwise discriminated against, especially women, children, Black, Indigenous communities, people of color. And so the speakers that we have today are three leaders who are on the front lines working with migrant communities. We have Odilia Romero, who is the co-founder, executive director of Comunidades Indígenas de Liderazgo, which is also can be called Cielo. She is an independent interpreter of Zapotec, Spanish, and English for Indigenous communities in Los Angeles and throughout different parts of California. She has over a decade of experience organizing Indigenous migrant communities. So welcome, Odilia. And we also have Lisa Richardson, who is with IWES staff. She joined there in July of 2013. And prior to that, she served as the National Director of Southern Access Project for Planned Parenthood Federation of America. She's a consultant, a program director, and evaluator for many organizations, including Emory University, the Carter Presidential Center, and the New Orleans-based education program. Last but not least, Lisbeth Ross, who is a psychologist with extensive experience working in private clinics, accompanying children and adolescents. Currently, she works at Top Notch Association in studio social support to migrant and return children and adolescents. She also works with the Maya Potsi community from Mexico and the United States in the registration process and their communities of origin. And so just thank you all for being here today. Lisa, I would love to start with you. And if you could talk to us a little bit about what is healing justice work and can the experience of working of Black communities with Black communities can teach us in the context of migration.
Thank you so much, Roman, and thank you for that introduction. And I'm incredibly honored to be a part of this conversation. Let me just begin by saying a little bit about our organization and our vision. And I want to start by saying that at IOS, which is short for the Institute of Women and Ethnic Studies, we see healing as an essential part of our work to improve the mental, physical, and spiritual health and quality of life for women, their families, and communities of color. And the organization was founded in 1993 by two Black women in New Orleans. And from the very beginning, we've worked alongside women, very closely with women who identify as Indigenous, Latina, and Asian. Over the years, we've also really developed partnerships that go very deep with people of many intersectional identities as we work in the reproductive justice world. And we also put a lot of energy and love into the work we do with young people and their adult caregivers, because we really see the promise and the power of doing intergenerational work that brings elders and youth together, particularly when we're talking about healing justice. So we're a public health organization that's community-based, and we approach health and well-being by seeing individual health and healing in the context of the family and the community and the society that we all create and live in each day. And our work started in the 1990s as part of a global movement for reproductive justice for women of color. And women of color, as we know, we always have to fight for our bodily autonomy and to resist systemic violence. As the Supreme Court Justice ruling overturning Roe has pointed out, that fight is far from over. Many of us on the call are probably a part of that movement. But with that background, let me just say a little bit about how we think about healing justice, and I'm going to offer a definition. It is not the only definition, and I would love to hear what other people are thinking about as they approach healing and the need to heal in their various communities and spaces of work. For us, healing justice identifies how we can holistically respond to and intervene on generational trauma and violence, and bring collective practices that can impact and transform the consequences of that violence and that oppression on our bodies and our hearts and our minds. And in this way of thinking, healing justice really emphasizes connecting to the whole self, which is something that I have to say is that many of us are conditioned out of in the society at large. We're conditioned to ignore the connection between our body, our heart, our mind, our spirit, our community, and the natural world. So for us, the healing justice kind of definition way of conceptualizing this work really puts the lens on repairing the harms done through generations of racism and discrimination and silencing and marginalization, all of these forms of oppression that we all face. And I do want to just note that in our work, we really stress that the harms that we are talking about are present for people in our communities, the people we work with and for, but they're also present in ourselves. And it's really important for those of us doing this work to give ourselves and our peers the space and encouragement and support to work on our own healing too. So to your question, Ramon, about lessons that can be learned from the work of Black communities historically, I'll offer three brief suggestions for everyone's consideration. First, I'd say that healing justice is intentionally anti-racist, and it's focused on creating liberatory spaces for people of all genders, all languages, all bodies, all cultures. To do this work, to do healing justice work, we all must really be committed to embracing those values in our organizations and in the world where we're doing the work. Secondly, I would say that healing justice really requires looking at systems and at the legacy of intergenerational trauma, all of the pieces where harm still lingers, and really beginning to restore ourselves, restore our communities, and heal those harms. So I'd say as a second point, educating ourselves about our own history and the stories and the struggles and the strengths of others in justice movements is really important to healing justice overall. We all have to know where we come from, but also understand the similarities for other people who are in this struggle for justice. And lastly, I'll say something that I think many on this call will agree with, that culture is an incredible resource. Cultural assets and traditions really are at the foundation of healing in many communities. And in the Black experience, Black artists and scholars and activists for years and years and years have noted that it's the cultural retentions that really enabled enslaved Africans to survive their forced migration to the Americas, and to not only survive that migration, but to also endure the brutality that they faced when they arrived, and to not just endure, but to go on and build healthy communities for themselves and for the generations to come. So I would just say to do healing justice work, we must all embrace our ancestral wisdom. And, to close that point, I would just want to acknowledge that for us as an organization at IWES, doing formal work in the migrant rights movement is a newer dimension of what we do. Some of us have been doing this work individually for some time, but as an organization, we were invited into this space by a funder. I guess I should name the funder, the K Kellogg Foundation. And that was after doing years and years of work on trauma responsive programs and services and working on policies to bring about more justice. And the foundation for that work really goes back more than 15 years. Our founder, Dr. Denise Shervington, and I started digging into this as a part of our organizational work, not just an extension of our personal passions, as we began to try to respond to the collective trauma of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And that was more than 15 years ago. And at the time, that was the largest disaster that this country had seen in hundreds of years. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, were forced to migrate. And trauma and poor mental and physical health was rampant. And Dr. Shervington is herself a migrant from Jamaica. And as I think I mentioned, a psychiatrist and a trauma expert. And so as a public health organization, when we start to witness the ways that the destructive forces of racism and marginalization were even more devastating than the winds and the rain and the waters, brought on by the awesome forces of nature, we really said, this is something that is going to require healing on a deep level, and it's going to require us looking at all of our systems. And we really witnessed the ways that Black people were displaced and migrant labor was exploited. And all of this was happening at the same time that Black and brown people were being sort of locked out of the recovery and rebuilding process. And these things often work together, right? So what we really began to do was think about more deeply about healing justice. And it wasn't the beginning of that work for us, but it really accelerated the work we were doing and expanded our thinking as a public health organization to look at the intersection of trauma and trauma responsive services and policies and care for individuals and families. The intersection of that with issues like access to healthcare and housing and safe working conditions and a living wage and equality education, all of these things working together. Flash forward to the COVID-19 pandemic, and all of these issues are immediately brought back to the surface, not just in New Orleans, but globally. And the same communities that were most affected by that natural disaster and many other disasters that have happened since Katrina were again disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So when the Kellogg Foundation invited us to share lessons that we'd learned for addressing trauma and asked us to join forces with migrant serving organizations in New Mexico, in the era of Title 42 or the Remain in Mexico policy, it really just felt like a natural extension of our work. And it gave us an opportunity to work in solidarity with other organizations who were demanding more humane treatment for asylum seekers and migrant families. And that's what has brought us into the space. And it feels like the alignment is there in terms of intention and a vision for a more just society. It's something we're really, really passionate about. Healing is the revolution is the byline of our organization. It's on our t-shirts. It became the name of Dr. Shervington's book. So I could talk at length about this, but I want to stop there and so I can hear from the other amazing people who are on this panel. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think you've hit on so many great points. And I hope, the audience really, takes away, especially the three that you mentioned around healing justice being anti-racist work, creating these spaces for liberation and really beyond just surviving, but really thriving for a community. And the importance of looking at systems, because even within our own organizations that we work out of, that is a system, and there is mending and healing that needs to be tended to, even within those spaces, so that it can then reverberate out. And so thank you so much for sharing that. I think especially something that resonated with me was, the healing coming from our own cultures, right? From our own ancestral wisdom, our histories. And it reminds me so much of, the healing that can come from storytelling, from plants, right? From medicines that we're used to. And so, Odelia, I'd love for the next question, if you could share a little bit about Cielo's perspective. What is your vision on healing justice, and how have Indigenous-led organizations and programs have responded to Indigenous migration? If you could share a little bit.
Hi, well, it's a pleasure to be here with you all. For Cielo, healing is also the basis of your human rights, right? We think about this violence that we lived for more than 500 years. We have to think about the roots of migration, that is that continued violence of 500 years. And when we talk about healing, for us, it's a holistic process in the org. In our org, one of the things that we do, like food, is healing. So we eat a lot in this office. My accountant gives me like a really hard time because I have like a budget for lunch. But that's a healing process, right? When you eat, when you share food, that is something. You heal through food, you heal through music, you heal through culture. So a lot of that happens here, but also we believe that there's no healing without language. Language is the basis of your human rights as well. We cannot talk about healing without talking about language rights. For a person to heal, things need to be done in their language, because there's different cultural concepts. There are different plants that we don't have the names in Spanish or English. I'm sure there's a scientific name. The colonizers did really well on giving their names to our plants, right? Their scientific names, but we know them in our language. So, without the language, there's no healing. And I'll share an example. The tragedy in San Antonio, we had a team out there supporting the families. The institutions were not responding in the language, in their language. There were 6 indigenous people from Oaxaca and a few more from Guatemala. And the communities connect, the families connect, community that communicate. The institutions were not responding. People wanted to know when their loved ones would get home. So our team went and knocked at funeral houses' doors. And one of them came back and said, that one came back last night and the other one came back on Friday. I cannot get the odor of the funeral home away from me. Like, it's there, it stays impregnated in me. Like, how do I do that? He came back last night. Immediately this morning, as an organization, we took him to a healer. He cannot stay with that energy that he was surrounded in for 2 weeks in San Antonio. That scent of the morgue has to go away. It's a morgue that deals with the very heavily decomposed bodies. So as an organization, it is something that we need to take care of. We immediately, the one that came back on Friday, we took them to a healer immediately. I, as an ED, drove them over. I'm like, okay, you guys cannot come into the office until you do a process of healing. It was a lot of pain, a lot of death that you went through these 2 weeks being in San Antonio. And some people might think that is so weird, like, you don't need to do that. No, you do need to do that. That as an organization, in order to sustain our staff, we need to walk people, like, for example, one of them is not Indigenous. He's Japanese. He's like, hey, you cannot come into the space with all that heavy energy. This is what our culture does. Are you willing to do this? He's like, yes, because it's very heavy in my heart. You know, so I think for Cielo, it's food, supporting the people that have, you know, all our staff is Indigenous, you know, but some have more linked to Christianity, some of them. I mean, there's a lot of things going on, but we have one common thing is the human rights. And we're like, okay, if you need to go to pray, let's do it. Whatever supports your soul, you know, but also we have a circle, a therapy circle, a healing circle every 2 weeks for our staff. And at Cielo, we believe like we cannot do this work unless we have these systems of healing in place. It's a lot of heavy things that we deal with every day. You know, currently we're dealing with a child lost in Veracruz, detained, you know, after running from a rape, you know, interpreting in different very heavy settings. I mean, we never interpret for good news, like let's say, oh, let's ask for, I don't know, marriage. I don't know if that's even a good news, but hey, it's an example. You know, it's always a tragedy that our team has to be involved on. So therefore, it's like, how do we do this process? So for us, it's very important, you know, and how do we support the migrant community? Well, we do through the language, but also there's not enough funding to support so much trauma that Indigenous people face, right? Like that kid that is now in the city, that the food is not what he used to eat or she used to eat back home, you know, or like to understand the schooling, like navigate the school system, knowing how to send back your court papers. I mean, all these institutional trauma that you keep on encountering as a daily basis when you don't speak the language, there's not enough funding for that. So I think those are some of the, we try our best to support through language rights, because once you get some information in your language, you know, maybe you could begin a healing process. But I live in LA County, and it is one of the largest city of Indigenous people from the Americas, but also has the largest kids that are being released here, that I know that they're going through a lot of trauma. But, you know, we have our literature conference, we have like wood carving that's very popular in Oaxaca, you know, paintings, that we have like art, language, music programs for the community. So yes.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think you touched on a really important point. And as well as Lisa, you know, especially in the US, there is this need to be productive, to work through the pain, you know, to work when you're sick. And it is a misconception. It is not the correct path. You know, it's important for us, even within our own organization, as Philanthropy, you know, seed different efforts and initiatives for us to also be checking in with our staff, right? Checking in with one another and holding space to listen, to be heard. And I just really appreciate, Odelia, the different examples of that you shared around what healing can look like, right? Art, wood carving, even just, you know, communicating in your own language can really be the basis for someone being able to share and to be well. And so thank you for that. Lisbeth, I would like to have the next question go over to you. If you could talk a little bit about what are the needs in Guatemala with Indigenous migrants in relation to maybe their mental health, their emotional well-being, what services do organizations offer, and what are some of the challenges that you're facing out in Guatemala?
Y muy bien. Tual tonin tiosh balde ya Manilan, o shimikul ngeyei, y shkokani parsit komam hawsh kam yamanon unesk balilti, y o shimianda tiatzich kototen unesk baltishin, no pueden. Y muy buenas tardes a todos. Y pues yo soy psicóloga y representante de la asociación POCNOG. Y la asociación POCNOG es una asociación civil no lucrativa, no partidista, que promueve la reflexión, el análisis, la investigación y el intercambio de aprendizajes. También facilita procesos de organización, formación, promoción y del buen vivir y a través de la cosmovisión del pueblo maya. Y de esta manera se trabaja y específicamente en el área MAM y el área Huista del departamento de Huehuetenango, que es un departamento que colinda con México, por lo tanto es fronterizo. Y de esta manera nos damos cuenta de la carencia de factores y principalmente del factor económico y la poca accesibilidad a los servicios básicos como lo es la alimentación, la salud, la educación y factores relacionados a la seguridad como el aumento de la delincuencia, de las extorsiones, también del cambio climático, del despojo de tierras a los pueblos originarios, que es una temática también y muy complicada para la población indígena. Estos temas son y coinciden con la problemática racial que ha existido en Guatemala a través de los años. Entonces es bastante preocupante observar a niños, niñas y adolescentes que migran con el sueño americano y generalmente son blancos fáciles de racismo y de exclusión. Y algo muy preocupante es de que la población que migra generalmente es esta que es marginada y utilizan un recurso económico para poder viajar. Generalmente lo hacen a través de ventas de propiedades para adquirir el apoyo económico o una deuda, lo cual al verse frustrado el sueño de poder migrar o de llegar a Estados Unidos, regresan con esta deuda que es la principal preocupación de las familias. De esta manera, la asociación apoya con una intervención gratuita de apoyos psicológicos, atención psicosocial de parte de trabajadoras sociales y psicólogas. También se les apoya y se les brinda lo que son iniciativas económicas y con los huertos familiares y gallinas ponedoras, que también tienen una finalidad terapéutica, y ya que lo adaptamos a lo que es la terapia ocupacional. De esta manera, la asociación pues coloca su granito de arena para poder apoyar a las familias necesitadas, principalmente de índole indígena. También la asociación por su misión y su visión involucra mucho el aspecto de la cultura, el respeto al idioma. Entonces, se cuenta con el personal para dar esta atención en el idioma que la familia necesita. Y en algunas experiencias migratorias se ha visto las prácticas culturales de lo que son las curaciones y tanto del miedo, también los rituales como son las limpias. Estos generalmente se realizan con personas y encargadas de la región. No cualquier persona lo puede hacer, tiene que ser alguien como generalmente las comadronas o algún líder comunitario específico, a través de la utilización de plantas medicinales y también el consumo de tés o infusiones, y que también que nos provee la madre naturaleza. Es necesario mencionar que este tipo de limpias no lo hacen con el afán de el autocuidado, sino más bien como una manera de unificar tres elementos, que es alma, cuerpo y mente, los cuales se han visto desequilibrados después de un proceso migratorio que generalmente provoca síntomas como, por ejemplo, cambios de conducta muy bruscos después de la experiencia, la caída del cabello, problemas alimenticios y también el que incida en cambios de pesos drásticos. Entonces, los pueblos originarios son conscientes de estos cambios que genera el proceso migratorio como un proceso traumático y también como todo proceso se tiene que realizar esta limpia o esta curación por 3 veces y donde la encargada tiene que hacer un ritual de curación donde se utilizan elementos también como la musicoterapia, que son elementales para los pueblos originarios. Y también nos hemos percatado de que es importante que como profesionales de la salud mental estemos dispuestas a adaptar las técnicas para el abordaje de cada caso. Y como el ejemplo de la terapia ocupacional, que la abordábamos con lo que es la agricultura, también la ludoterapia, y la asociamos más con el rescate de juegos ancestrales, como lo es el trompo o algunas cuestiones relacionadas a la cultura, y también la arteterapia a través de la elaboración de la indumentaria o bordados, que es muy importante. Entonces, la Asociación POPNOF ofrece estos servicios a la población indígena que de verdad es vulnerada y a través de este proceso de migración. Y una de los desafíos que podríamos mencionar es la militarización y la cierre de las fronteras, ya que específicamente los más vulnerables son mujeres, niñas, niños y más aún si es de índole indígena. Por lo tanto, es necesario concientizar a los gobernantes, a los países para poder crear reformas o programas que puedan salvaguardar la dignidad de estas personas. También es necesario el implementar políticas que resguarden estas prácticas, como por ejemplo el uso o el implemento de la indumentaria, que en muchas de las ocasiones las mujeres son despojadas de la indumentaria para no ser blancos fáciles de deportación y pues prácticamente la indumentaria es algo que nos identifica, que es parte de nuestra cultura, de nuestra identidad y este proceso no es nada fácil al momento de retornar a su ciudad de origen y es difícil poder abordar estos temas de vulneración y más cuando el personal no es el adecuado, que no habla el idioma. Entonces es sumamente importante implementar y tener el personal adecuado para abordar la temática de la migración. También es importante la dignificación de las personas migrantes. Las personas indígenas sufren mucho de vulneración, de racismo, de discriminación. Entonces, prácticamente es necesario erradicar esta cultura de violencia que se les genera, que por el hecho de ser indígena no significa que somos menos y al contrario, unifiquemos nuestros conocimientos para crear lazos, para crear alianzas y ser mejores personas cada día. De esta manera, me gustaría también el comentar acerca de la asociación, de que con anterioridad se inició en el 2006 aquí en Guatemala y no es a partir del 2017 que se implementa una psicóloga en la asociación y debido a que se tenían patrones comportamentales y que pues nuestras compañeras técnicas de campo bien hacían un trabajo excepcional, pero hay cosas que no estaban en sus capacidades. Entonces es necesario el poder identificar cuándo y cuánto personal se necesita para el abordaje de esta temática. Y hoy tenemos pues 2 instalaciones en donde nos es muy gratificante poder apoyar desde nuestra perspectiva y a las poblaciones que de verdad lo necesitan. Y si bien contamos con organizaciones gubernamentales que se preocupan por el retorno de la población, más no en la reintegración, que es un proceso fundamental, porque después, ¿qué sigue? ¿Cómo me adapto? Entonces, es un proceso meramente y excepcional para nosotros el poder trabajar esto con las familias y no solo con las familias, sino que con la comunidad en general.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I feel like just after hearing everyone share, there are a lot of similarities in the approach, right? And the attention to the, the uniqueness that comes with different healing cases. And so when I think about, the role of the funder, I definitely want to lift up that there is not one solution for all, as Lisbeth mentioned, but that there is the opportunity for cross-learning between movements, and there is power in that. Lisa, I wonder if you could share a little bit about what learning about healing between different movements can promote. And I know that I think there is a project as well with IRES and HIP, and so maybe you could touch a little bit on that as well.
Sure, Ramon. I will say that, personally, I feel like struggles for justice and movements for justice on issues that kind of touch on all people can, in some ways, make the connections between working across movements a little easier to see. And, as an example, I think of issues like reimagining the criminal legal system and the movement for health and housing, again, as human rights, and movements for food sovereignty and climate justice. Those are the kinds of things that I think certainly affect everybody who's in this conversation, and everyone else, some of whom don't necessarily see the natural connections. But for those of us who are in this healing justice space, I think we have the opportunities to really put some emphasis on celebrating the ways that there are more things that bring us together than divide us. A lot of our uniqueness is in our individual cultural pathways, but the struggle for rights and humanity are shared across different cultures. So I think that that's one way to begin thinking about how we can learn from each other. Just as a matter of fact, I think migration as a large topic is going to continue and perhaps accelerate as there are changes in the natural world and forces of economic inequality, continue to deepen the gap between the haves and the have-nots, so to speak, deepen. And so I think the migrant and migration experience is something that will continue to touch everyone's lives. So as just one example of that you alluded to a little bit, of something that HIP and IWES are doing right now is we're in this learning journey together to really try to deepen our shared understanding of what the healing needs are for all of us as we're facing growing numbers of people who are migrating, and understanding how to apply a healing justice lens to the work. So in a collaborative project that we're doing right now, we are learning from many organizations and leaders who are telling us about the healing needs of migrants and sharing with us how their organizations are responding to these needs and collaborating with other groups in their localities or across borders. And really the goal of the work is to help identify opportunities to support and promote collective action. And this is something that HIP is very committed to, and iOS is working in partnership to kind of help gather information and have these conversations, facilitate some of these conversations. And we're just beginning, but I think the power of having these discussions and learning together across multiple geographies and talking about healing justice and sharing ideas about what that means is really important as groups like HIP and other funders try to think about how to fill some of the gaps and how to support organizations in doing the kinds of things that the other panelists have talked about, providing basic services, providing mechanisms to create support within organizations and that kind of work, I should say, which is really going to sustain all of the movement for justice among migrant serving organizations. So we plan to present some of the findings as we get closer to having something to share. We could talk a little bit more about the project and the way it's designed, later in the conversation if people are interested. But I do want to just give a shout out to HIP for investing time and energy into thinking deeply about this and thinking deeply about the role that you all can play as a funder to support healing justice work, because as others have mentioned, it is not something that is formally supported in a lot of spaces, even though the people who are on the front line are pouring, body, mind, soul into the work. So I think conversations like this one can be a powerful guide for not just funders, but for all of us as we begin to try to make new connections.
Yes, I completely agree. I feel like, folks who are on the front lines are really pouring everything and giving everything that they have, their love, their energy, their spirit, their knowing, which really connects to the next question, Odilia, which is, how can philanthropy support these diverse programs for healing, even at the organizational level? What is the impact that it can have, that this work can have on individuals who are supporting migrant communities, and how do you see the role of healing for those folks looking like? So if you could speak a little bit to that.
Well, I think I mentioned it earlier. It is important for the leadership. For in our case, we have a network of over 350 Indigenous interpreters, and when they interpret, they don't interpret like fun stuff, like we're going to the movies. No. It's usually murder, rape, deportation. So there's a secondhand trauma that everybody goes to. But then when they report back to us, or when we assign them a case, we learn about it too. And for example, myself and another gentleman, we've been doing this work for more than 20 years, and communities will always call us, hey, I have a body that is lost in the desert, or I have this other issue. So it always impacts us. And I think one of the things for us is philanthropy needs to be able to set aside or allow us to do some stuff, like, for example, the culture. Yes, there's funds for that, but for healing, for the stuff, like say, I want a candle of lavender because I just want like a little peace of mind in my office, that is not allowed in expenses, right? Or somebody has COVID in my organization, I would like to give them like a gift card so they could order food to heal in the process. Oh, a lot of those little tiny things make a big difference in an organization or on a leader's life. Like the case of San Antonio, I reach out to some funders. I'm like, communities are calling us. What do we do? And they're like, well, we don't fund service. And I'm like, well, it's not service. I mean, to you it sounds service, but this is a human rights crisis. They were pushed out of their land, forced to come into this trailer, die out of thirst. Is not a service. This is a human right for their bodies to get home. And somebody needs to be in between the double institutions. That's what I call this consulate, the double institutions and the community to make this happen. But that person in that sandwich, is going through a lot. It's going through a lot, like having to communicate on both sides and knowing that the nation states are not responding. It's very frustrating, and how do we heal that people doing this work? I think more trust-based funding would really to support the healing movement of people in organizations would be really appreciated. I fight with my accountant all the time because no, you cannot buy plants, you cannot buy lavender for the office. And I say, yes, I can, because the work, like she told me, oh, you should do your retreat in your backyard. You guys have an amazing backyard. And I say, that would be great. But guess what? When people deal with so much violence, it is okay to go to a retreat in nature where the staff could reset, right? So I'm always in constant fights with our accountant because she's like, no. I'm like, yes, because it's important. Like I think philanthropy should invest more in the well-being of the leaders of the organization, because I know there's not enough money to heal the entire community of 500 years of violence and a nonstop high intensity violence that Indigenous people are going through every day and everywhere, right? But we need to prepare a group of leaders to embrace, the healing process. It's okay to have a meal. It is okay to have lavender in your office, and you could order it from the office, because if that's something that suits your soul after interpreting a terrible session, it's okay to take a walk, around the block to decompress. It's okay for you to light a candle or to go in the corner and pray, or go to the garden and pray. Like whatever heals your soul, we're here to support, but we need philanthropy support to make that happen. Because I don't think like people realize, like I'll use Cielo, for example. We put a lot of fun stuff on social media, the fun things that we do because of HIPAA and all other contracts and DAs. We really can't share much about what happens with the children, what happens at the border. And we'll occasionally share something that we can, but that is not shared. So when we go looking for funding for that, that is considered a service, but it's not. It's a human right to be able to understand how to get a body back home after being forced to migrate, right? So I think philanthropy, we need your support, to be here longer. And I'm glad to be participating with Lisa's program with HIP about how philanthropy could support. And I really appreciate HIP for having this conversation. If we're not healed and if we're not curing our souls, it's really hard to do this work, and it leads to burnout, and it leads to people moving to another type of job, retiring from activism, right? So how do we sustain and create more leaders to continue doing this work? As for Indigenous people, it's just, the intensity is just going to grow because we have water. We have 80% of natural resources, and we're only 10% of the population. So basically they're out to get us, and there's going to be a lot of more trauma coming for us. So how do we prepare?
Yes. And I feel like really philanthropy needs to be doing the healing work themselves too. And I think that is one way to really open up, your mind and think more broader around what does healing and wellness look like? How does it show up in different cultures and different traditions? in different medicines. And so I just really appreciate everything that's been shared so far. And yeah, I hope that, you know, philanthropy as a whole as well could really be more curious and really be open to these different ways of doing the work. And we are going to have time for questions. If folks have any questions, feel free to put it into the chat. We're going to have a little bit of time carved out to talk about those questions you may have. The last question for our panelists is going to go to Lisbeth. Can you talk to us a little bit about how philanthropic organizations can support some of the mental well-being work in Central America? What are some of the other issues needed that need more support? I know you talked about it a little bit earlier, but if you could speak a little bit more to the mental well-being and what you would like to see or what you see is necessary, that'd be great.
Y muy bien, y pues yo concuerdo mucho con Odilia al respecto de que no se tiene el recurso económico para principalmente el autocuidado del personal. Y debido a que todo el apoyo es para las familias, para las personas migrantes indígenas, y pues damos, y hasta cierto punto esto es muy cargado, muy desgastante, y el personal no tiene estos pequeños espacios, talleres, o simple y sencillamente, como ella lo indicaba, alguna oportunidad de poder y de conectarse con sí mismo y de liberar estas cargas energéticas, porque quiera o no, trabajamos con cargas energéticas. Cada familia es un caso y cada caso es muy complejo. Entonces es necesario que los donantes se tomen en cuenta este tipo de abordaje que se le puede dar a la atención, porque si bien escuchamos que una frase de que un ciego no puede guiar a otro ciego, y si el personal no está bien emocionalmente, no podrá dar el 100% para el apoyo de las personas que lo necesitan. También y el poder y tomar conciencia de poder contratar a personal, debido a que en ocasiones se sobrecarga el personal que se tiene. Entonces es necesario poder identificar en dónde se necesita o qué tipo de personal se necesita. Supongamos en el área huista, que es donde yo trabajo, y ahorita se implementó una técnica agrícola porque solo contábamos con uno, y al compañero se le dificultaba el poder estar en un área y después en otra. Había una sobrecarga totalmente. Entonces es importante poder implementar estas oportunidades laborales también para la población y dar oportunidades a las personas jóvenes de poder involucrarse en este tipo de temáticas que pues son las que agobian a la sociedad centroamericana, no solo a la guatemalteca, porque el proceso migratorio es algo que ha acompañado a la humanidad por lo largo de la historia, y pensar en erradicar la migración es una total locura, porque es algo que no se va a poder hacer. Simple y sencillamente podemos asesorar a las personas para que el día que decidan o no decidan migrar, pues sea como que una opción de ellos y que no sea la única alternativa, ¿verdad? Entonces también es importante que la filantropía tenga esos espacios de empoderamiento a la población, debido principalmente a las mujeres, a las niñas, a los niños y a los jóvenes, para que el migrar de verdad sea una decisión propia y que no sea obligada por prácticamente los males sociales que rodean a la población centroamericana. Eso sería.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Lisa, Lisbeth, Odilia, very much. Now we are going to open it up to questions If folks have a question, please feel free to raise your hand. You can speak in either English or Spanish. So we're just going to give a second. This is a great opportunity to speak with some of the leaders in the community. No questions? Got it all figured out?
Hi,
Go
Stephanie.
ahead, Lorena.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Lorena Gonzalez. I work with the Young Center for Immigrant Children's Rights. Gracias, Lisbeth, Odilia, and Lisa. I was wondering if any of you could speak to just like how, as we all know, a lot of funders require measurable outcomes for like showing that programs have impact, et cetera, et cetera. And because we don't necessarily operate in a trust-based philanthropic world, which I think would be ideal if we did, how do you even go about measuring like healing justice work? Like what do you even look for? What do you report on? Like, how do you show impact? Because I feel like your work is so qualitative or it's so observational. From where I'm sitting, I can only imagine it's hard to show that impact. And I'd just be curious to learn about how you guys even talk to funders about that.
What an interesting question. We have a hard time showing that we exist. I mean, you know, there's this narrative of everybody from south of the imposed border are Latinos or Latine. And there's no acknowledgement that in Mexico, there's 68 indigenous nations, in Guatemala, more than 22. And we go throughout the Abya Yala, there's many languages spoken. But there's an assumption in the US, including in philanthropy, that everybody is Latine. And that there's a stereotype that we have to fit, right? So we already have a hard time really showing that we exist as indigenous people. When we're talked about, is usually we are talked about as a thing of the past. You know, the Mayans were taken by extraterrestrials. The Aztec existed, you know. The Zapotecs existed and they were great, but they're no longer great because they exist. Kind of is the narrative that we hear out there. But I think that's it's very challenging, because the other thing that we see, for example, is that me, Odilia, with this skin color and wearing this huipil does not get the same welcome that you would get wearing the huipil. You know, you could show up in an outfit and say, I'm indigenous, I'm Mexica. They will believe you, they will welcome you because you fit the stereotype that they want. A lighter skinned Indian is welcome, but a dark skinned Indian like me is not welcome in these spaces many times, right? So we have to start with that. Anybody that could claim Mexica, they could claim whoever they are, and their lighter skin show up with a huipil, they're embraced. We're not, you know. And HIP has been one of the foundations that has been in solidarity, that has brought us into this conversation with Pop Nog and other Native allies. And it's really hard to show the impact. You know, it's like, what does success look like? This is what it looks like. I'm alive and I exist and I speak my language. That's what success looks like. So I'll stop there.
Lisbeth, ¿querías contestar?
Sí, y perdón, no escuché bien. Y pues en relación a eso hay ciertas cuestiones, ¿verdad? Y se trabaja con personas y ellas nos confían su historia. Y esta historia no podemos venir y divulgarla con todo el equipo. Y aunque el proceso como tal y es paulatino, es difícil el poder ganarnos la confianza para que nos cuenten la historia como tal. Bueno, después de esto se empiezan las intervenciones y estas intervenciones tienen que ser planificadas, puntuales y que sean contextualizadas al entorno de la persona. Y cuando esto sucede, y obviamente tenemos un registro de cómo se trabaja, pero es un registro que no podemos compartir, aunque quisiéramos, con las organizaciones donantes. La única satisfacción que queda es al finalizar el proyecto con la familia y ver la familia nos dicen agradecidos de que sí hay cambios y un niño que antes no quería salir, ahora ya sale, ya juega, ya comunica, que los berrinches disminuyeron, que ahora le va bien en la escuela, que ya se integró a su comunidad. Entonces, esta satisfacción de poder ver a los niños, adolescentes y el reintegrarse es pues prácticamente con lo que nos quedamos. Y pues el proceso en sí es muy difícil de documentar porque son más cualitativos, como lo indicaba, y pues la confianza que las organizaciones o las asociaciones tienen en uno como profesional tiene que ser fundamental para que este hecho se dé. Gracias.
Lisa?
The two other speakers have really said all that I would say. The only other thing I would offer goes back to Adelia's original point, which what we try to do is to talk with funders about the importance of being able to define what success looks like for our own work and not necessarily using preset metrics that don't reflect the realities of our lives, the communities we're working as a part of, the way that we would like to see the impact of our work resonate. And so I frequently am in a space of advocating for rethinking how we define success and evaluation. And that some of it is process oriented and it's very qualitative because these are complex issues and human lives. And, we can count numbers of people that we engage and work with, but the true beauty of the work and the lasting impact is something much richer. And so I like to try to have that conversation with the funders who trust us. As Elizabeth points out, if there's no trust there, then there's not much, there's nowhere to go in terms of talking about reimagining the vision of success.
Thank you, Lisbeth, Lisa, Lorena, for the questions. Carolina, I see you have your hand raised. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yes, hi. Sorry, we're driving through the reservation in the Cherokee Nation, Oklahoma. So we might lose you because we pass through areas that don't have reception. I'm really appreciative of this meeting and HIP for putting it on and for all of the speakers. I feel like get a lot of anxiety because I think it brings up a lot for me. Personally, I think a lot of people, we might have gotten into this work because of our own trauma and our own, continuing work against colonialism.
Carolina, you're breaking in and out. Can you hear me?
And so, I said I work with her on this call from Comunidad.
Yeah, you're breaking in and out.
I can hear you. Hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I'll try. We're about to get on another freeway. Hopefully our road, this will work. Can you hear me?
Yeah, if you could send your question in the chat. I don't know if someone
Okay.
else is driving,
Can-
but I'm thinking.
Yeah, somebody
Mhm.
else is driving. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah. So I think like when you come to this with your own trauma from colonialism, and then you also are working on these cases, like Odilia was saying, you're hearing about people's like worst moments. You're hearing stories of genocide. You're hearing stories of rape. You're, exposed to some really intense stuff. And, I don't know that I do it well with the people that I mentor. I don't know that I help them well enough by saying that, like, be careful about vicarious trauma and stuff. Because I know for myself, I found that, especially as an attorney, we're not allowed to, share those stories. And so what we do is we just hold them and carry them. So besides our own stories of trauma that we, have safely buried inside of ourselves, we also are carrying other people's stories in our hearts. And that can be really heavy and hard on your spirit and your heart. And so, I know that we talk about this, but it's like, I don't really think I have the answer of like, what do I do with that? Because I still feel that I will carry all of these stories forever with me. And there's really sort of, besides ceremony, there's no sort of other good way that I found to sort of deal with them, which was part of the impetus of moving back to the reservation and near ceremonial grounds so that I could continue to do the work and have the type of spiritual support and ceremony that I needed. So I don't know if somebody has the answer of like, what do you do with all those stories you carry around?
So the question I hear is, what do you do with the stories you hear and pick up from the work?
Yeah, because people have told me about the smell of rotting bodies, or how they douse themselves with bleach after they were raped, or trafficking victims, all these things. And it's like when you're hearing those stories and when you're traveling to places where genocide is happening and things, it's like you are constantly in a state of crisis, or you have to learn how to bury that so that you can put one foot in front of the other and wake up in the morning and do your work, right? And so for folks that are really in the trenches, and living this and exposed to trauma constantly, like I don't know, really great ways outside of ceremony and therapy and stuff. And I'm wondering what are other people doing when they have to carry and hold all of those private stories? How do they manage that on their heart and soul?
Would anybody like to share? Odilia, Lisbeth, or Lisa?
I don't think there's well, again, like it's I'm gonna be that person in the room. Like not all of us have access to ceremony, right? So a lot of people just go around carrying all this trauma. Some people pray, some people exercise. Like for our case in LA, the ceremonies were taken from us as Zapotec, so we have no ceremonies left. And I'm not going to be that person to go and insert myself in the Native American community and say, hey, like, allow me to use your fire because mine was taken away. I can't do that. So some of us, like I bike, I box, because that's what I have. And I know some of the staff, they do hiking, others run, but a lot of, especially speaking for Cielo, we don't have access to ceremony or anything like that because it was taken away from us as Zapotecs, as Mixtecs. So a lot of the things that we do have access to is Catholicism or Christian, right? So that's a lot of people go to church, a lot of people, but I don't think there's a right way or a solution. I mean, everything was taken from a lot of us with the colonizers. You know, our ceremonial books were burned, a lot of things. So we really don't have much. Like those that have the privilege to have access to fire, or that have access to, that are welcomed by other natives being non-native. I mean, hold on to those spaces, because a lot of us have to carry this trauma.
Lisbeth? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Perdón, no me percaté. Y bueno, en relación a la pregunta, y pues, pues comunicar, ¿verdad? De que eso es completamente normal que ocurra, porque somos seres humanos y hay que reconocer que al estar enfrente de otra persona, pues ser empáticos y pues este trabajo que realizamos generalmente ocurre lo que es la contratransferencia y nos hacemos propios de las historias de las personas que nos cuentan y que a la larga se vuelve un saco pesado. Y hay que tener mucho cuidado con esto. Por eso es necesario identificar hasta dónde me está afectando, si se está volviendo clínicamente significativo, es decir, me afecta en alguna área de mi vida, entonces el poder buscar ayuda y tener tal vez como que y presionar un poquito a las instituciones de que también es importante tener ayuda psicológica para el personal. No solo los espacios de autocuidado, sino que también el tener a un especialista para poder apoyar en este sentido. Esta sería mi participación.
I will say that I think for me, it's over time learning the things that give me healing and, you know, allow me to recharge myself, being aware of when I feel like I'm approaching burnout and stepping back, which is, again, a little bit counterculture in our world, where those of us who are in the work do it because we feel that it goes deep to, you know, the core of us, and also we want to be, you know, productive and all of the things that come along with working in the Western world. But I also find that it's helpful for me to do my individual work and to learn, you know, get to know myself enough to know, when do I need to go be outside? When do I need a personal day? When do I need time off? When do I need my oil diffuser, if not a lavender candle or something like that? But also building in spaces to process and talk with others who might be having a similar experience, either coworkers or people that I trust, so that I'm not just holding it inside of me. I don't want to run from the feelings. So I want to sit with what I'm feeling, but I also want to be able to connect with others in that space in ways that are healthy for me. So I think those things are important, because feeling isolated in it can add to the sense of burden.
Thank you, Lisa, Lisbeth, and Odelia, Carolina, for the question. We have time for one more speakers and the audience member, and I'm going to ask just that you take no more than 4 minutes as we move into the closing. But Xiomara, I believe you wanted to share about the Four Freedoms Fund.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. Just on your invitation in terms of what can philanthropy do different. So the Four Freedoms Fund is a pooled fund. So it's not like we have an endowment. We have limited funding to fund the immigrant justice movement. And we just launched an Indigenous migrant initiative, and Cielo and Pishanishim are part of that. And I think the most critical part is, you know, asking for general support dollars instead of project support, right? Because you cannot measure this. There isn't a measure for healing justice. It is a process, it's ongoing, it never stops. And I think too, I mean, part of like, you know, there's like a whole movement around decolonizing philanthropy, etc. Mama, I'm on the phone, okay? Nope, you cannot touch that. I'm on the phone, okay? Go talk to your cousins. So I think there's an, I'm gonna run away. I'm not even in charge today. So I think that part of the other piece, it's like what we're doing is, I've been on my own healing journey, right? So philanthropy, I think as institutions, like they will not, and I don't think it's their place to pay for their staff to go through their own healing process. You know, that's not appropriate. But I do think that, you know, it's important to, like, for us to have spaces like this to learn from other folks as we go on our healing journey. And then the other piece is that I continue to, like, through this space and through meeting people, through recommendations from Odilia or from other people, we actually provide capacity building for our organizations. And a lot of the organizations and folks are folks who are removed from cultural practice, from Indigenous cultural practices, or maybe like remembering or recalling those practices. And so we just use a lot of different providers, and we just put it out and say, hey, we have 4 slots. We put aside this money. We have 4 slots for this healing justice piece, whoever wants to participate, you know? And so they work. And then the other piece, because we do a lot of infrastructure capacity building, is we brought in Gabrielle Jackson, who used to be with UndocuBlack, and Dr. Dayanara, oh my gosh, I forget her last name, Dominican sister, Black Latinx sister. So they're actually working with several organizations on healing justice on how to actually put it into their personnel policies. And so we're paying for that. The groups get to apply for that, and then the provider chooses who they're going to work with. So those are just some of the ways that we're supporting this type of work. But again, we keep learning and understanding there's not a model for this. There's not an outcome. Not everyone is going to respond to the same type of offering.
Thank you for sharing, Xiomara. I really appreciate it. And I just want to say one final thank you to the speakers and for everyone allowing me to come into this space and moderate. I am going to turn it over to Jose, who is an awesome manager here at HIP. I know that she has a few words to share before we come to a close with this panel.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Roman. Yeah, I'm Jose. I'm on the migration team. I'm based in Mexico, and we've been preparing this webinar together with Amalia, Andrea, Mario, and Roman. And we are very grateful to our speakers and of course to Roman. You did a great job as always as a moderator for this group. And I just wanted to mention that, yeah, we will send you an email with the recording of this webinar so you can share it with your teams, and we will send the summary document. And also I wanted to announce our next webinar which will be in a month, in August, where we will continue the conversation in this occasion about racism and how we can confront racism in the migration movement. So I thank you again. I just wanted to mention also that there were a lot of positive comments in the chat box that maybe the panelists weren't able to read. They were not questions, but there were very positive comments from different organizations that also work with migrants, that are also partners in our program, from the US, from Mexico, from Central America. I just wanted to share so you know that, that I think everybody learned so much. I learned so much from this conversation. Thank you again on behalf of the HIP Migration team, and we hope to see you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias, feliz tarde.